Caesar wrote his treatise on analogy while fighting in Gaul.
Yes.
While he was fighting one of the most dangerous campaigns in the history of Rome.
He was like writing it while like spears were flying left and right. Caesar was famous for being able to multitask.
Rome was fine when the Romans practiced virtue. All went down the gutter when they started studying it.
From Caesar's style, you can't take anything away because it's so bare.
Right.
But to Cicero's style, you can't add anything
Right,
because
right.
all the variations have already been rung.
There's something distinctively Ciceronian about skepticism and skeptical about Cicero. There's a beautiful aesthetic congruency between their intellectual life and their political life.
The skeptical method clearly appealed to Cicero because it was so close to oratory.
How can a skeptic be a forceful political actor? Because when we think skeptic, they can't take one step because they don't know if this is going to be ground.
You can't be totally sure, but you're pretty sure. I mean, you're sure enough for the purpose of action.
Why has the contemplative and active life drifted so far apart in our age? And what enabled the top men of action to also be the great intellectuals of their age? Before I die, I'd like to have lived both the contemplative and active life. A life dedicated to understanding the world, but also to shaping it. And that's quite a tall order today. Because on one hand, you have academics who are increasingly specialized and mostly writing for other specialists. And on the other hand, you have the elite, business people, politicians, celebrities, who are probably the least cultured elite we've ever had. Go look at Harvard's entrance exams just 100 years ago, or look at one of Lincoln's speeches and you'll see what I mean. But this wasn't always the case. There were times when these two paths were much closer coupled, and one such time is the late Roman Republic. People like Cicero and Caesar weren't just the leading political figures of their day, but also the leading intellectuals. And let me be clear, they weren't writing lightweight popular books like the self-congratulatory memoirs our elites write. They wrote serious treatises and epic poems. They covered statecraft, ethics, oratory. Their intellectual contributions actually dwarfed that of the full-time intellectuals of their day. My guest today is one of the world's top classicists, Katharina Volk, and she'll help us understand what made this combination of action and contemplation possible by sharing with us the incredible intellectual lives of Cicero and Caesar. What I found most striking in her portrait is the incredible congruency between their ideas and their lives. Caesar, for example, was a rational, direct, and blunt man. And you see this reflected in his writing style. It's terse, it's to the point, there's little embellishment. Caesar composed a landmark treatise on Latin grammar, where he argued for strict rules even if they went against conventional uses of language. And you see the same in his political actions. Crossing of the Rubicon, his calendar reforms, declaring himself dictator for life, he was willing to disrupt convention and impose upon it a new order. By the way, Caesar composed that treatise in the heat of a military campaign when he was leading an army across the Alps. So if nothing else, I found the consistency between their ideas, politics, and character aesthetically beautiful, and I hope you will too. My name is Jonathan B. I'm studying the great books and sharing their insights through lectures and interviews. If you want to join my journey and learn with me, please subscribe. Without further ado, Professor Katharina Volk. So your book, Roman Republic of Letters, is focusing on the intellectual as well as political elite of the Roman Republic, with Cicero being one of them. And what's crazy about these times is that the political elite had significant overlap with the intellectual elite. So let me give you a quote, which I think is one of the most fascinating stories in your entire book. This is about Brutus when he's trying to get conspirators to sort of assassinate Caesar. I quote to your book. Brutus submitted potential co-conspirators to a covert aptitude test by involving them in a general philosophical discussion about the role of the wise man in a law-flouting monarchy. Both Favonius and Statilius flunked the test by maintaining, respectively, that civil war was worse than tyranny and that the wise man would not expose himself to danger for the benefit of the stupid multitude. Only Labeo, who disagreed with both, was taken into Brutus's confidence and made a member of the team. It is remarkable that decisions about a political assassination were taken in the context of a joint philosophical debate among Roman senators. These are the types of events that we're seeing in this period.
Right, that's true. And I mean, there you see that when we're talking about the intellectual activities of these people, we're not just talking about some sort of leisure time, read a book in your villa, cultural capital, show how learned you are by displaying beautiful Greek statues or something like this. But we're talking about, in this case, philosophy as something that is actually shaping the ethical decision of individuals, in this case, major political events. So what we see in the middle of the 1st century BCE is indeed a great cultural flourishing at Rome. And I think there are a number of sort of developments that are coming together. Rome has been growing in power in the Mediterranean for centuries. They have been very much influenced by Greek literature also for a long time. But it is sort of at this period that Rome and Roman writing and Roman thought is sort of coming into its own, and that the upper classes to which Cicero belonged are really embracing culture, including Greek culture, in a way that is just sort of becoming second nature. And this was also a time really when Roman writing, and especially Roman prose writing, reached a new level of excellence. And indeed, Cicero and Caesar were the two masters of the Latin language that really shaped the form of Latin writing for years to come, and even today, because if you learn Latin in school, what you learn is the Latin of Cicero and Caesar.
Right. And this is why I'm so excited to discuss your book, and why I found the times that your book captured so captivating, is because when we look today at the active and the contemplative life, they're pulled very much far apart, right? The only serious intellectuals, I would wager, are people like yourself in the academy. And that has become extremely specialized, abstract, and often disjointed from political or practical concerns. And then you have, quote unquote, people who live the life of action, right? These are the businessmen, the politicians.
Right.
And you can't imagine our businessmen, CEOs, and politicians today gathering people in a platonic dialogue to create it's like, what is the nature of taxation, right? That's just something impossible today. So why has the contemplative and active life drifted so far apart in our age? And what enabled the top men of action to also be the great intellectuals of their age?
Well, I think one of the reasons is institutionalization and professionalization. And this is something that was already going on at the time. So it was just a time when there still was comparatively little of professionalization and institutionalization. But even at this time, and very shortly thereafter, you then get like Roman rhetorical schools, and other forms of teaching becomes much more institutionalized. And then in the modern world, I mean, this continues. And then I think starting in the 19th century with the creation of the modern university and enormous specialization and enormous like long periods of training. I mean, before you get a PhD, it's going to take a long time. Before you become a professor, it takes a long time. And so that then, creates a totally different world. I mean, the other reason is that I think there is a comparatively small aristocracy that has been running politics and society in Rome for a very long time. And so if these people, get more and more interested in, intellectual concerns, then, that is going to color what is going on. So this sort of coherence and this sort of societal structure, I think, plays a huge role.
One thing I do want to clarify here is not to think about people like Caesar and Cicero in how we think about our public intellectuals today, where most public intellectuals are intellectual lightweights. Caesar and Cicero, they wrote specialized treatises on oratory, on divination. So there's a way in which Roman specialization of knowledge, unlike specialization today, did not push everyone into being professional scholars, i.e., the sort of public intellectuals were also the leading specialists. Is that right?
I think, yes, in terms of content, there is certainly some form of specialization. But I think the difference is that these people don't consider themselves intellectuals. So they considered themselves really members of the learned upper classes, aristocrats, as we would later say, dilettanti. So it's part and parcel of their overall persona, of their personalities as politicians, as aristocrats, leading members of leading families, that they are doing that. And it's not something that you do to make a living. Right. I think that's a big difference.
Right. And you describe the intellectual class as being two-tiered, right? One is the Roman intellectual elite, and these were the politicians, senators who were also intellectuals. There was this underclass of Greek professional scholars who did do it as a living. But the crazy thing seems to be that the dilettante had greater influence on intellectual life than the specialist. Is that a fair understanding?
I guess you're right. I mean, Cicero and Cicero's philosophical writings have had way more influence than any of contemporary philosophers or even some other very well-known Greek philosophers of other periods.
Right. Well, can you help us contrast these two groups, these professional scholars and these gentleman scholars, aristocratic sort of philosophers? Did they have different concerns in the type of work they were doing? Did they practice philosophy differently? Just flesh out their respective intellectual diets for us.
Right. I mean, there was a lot of interaction, right? Because these gentlemen scholars, they studied with these philosophers, and they had personal relationships with them. So, for example, Cicero had a Stoic philosopher, a blind Stoic philosopher, Diodotus, live in his house. So for many years, so he was a house guest. So they would be interacting continuously, and Cicero would read maybe their works, ask them questions, debate with them. So it's not like these two worlds were totally separate. But the Greeks, they taught. And the stereotype would be that they were more dedicated to, very minute questions of doctrine, making interventions in these debates, basically speaking to other philosophical writers, other Greeks, writing and teaching in Greek, which these Roman aristocrats, were totally fluent in. But the Romans, of course, well, not entirely, but increasingly were writing in Latin, right? So Cicero and also Lucretius, they were really beginning to create a philosophical idiom and a philosophical literature in Latin. And they were in a way more outward facing, or facing, writing for their own class, i.e. the educated Roman elite.
Right, I see. And another key difference between their intellectual diets, if you will, seems to be the social nature of this upper class scholarship, where they would go on grand tours together. They would borrow books. Can you elaborate and maybe tell a story or two about this type of social factor about their learning? Because that's very important.
Right. So they had sort of various groups or concentric circles of friends, and with some of them, they engaged in joint study. So they might be reading things together or have them read out to them. They exchanged books. There certainly is a whole thing where, I dedicate a book to you, and then you in turn, I expect...
You write a book and dedicate it to me.
Exactly. I write a book and dedicate it to you, but then I expect that when you next write a book, you better dedicate it to me as well. You send each other books. You borrow books because there are no public libraries, but a lot of these rich aristocrats have very nice private libraries. You ask each other questions. I mean, the thing about Cicero is we have 900 letters by Cicero, including many to his best friend Atticus, who was also a very learned man. And so he asks him questions. He sort of tells him what's going on with his writing, what he's debating, doing. It seems to be a very social enterprise. And it sort of maps onto the social life of these people anyway, which is, of course, also maps onto their political life, because these are the senators, they are also the political elite, and they are running the republic.
Right. Do you see any substitute of this type of activity in modernity, in the current world now? Because obviously, I think classics and philosophy nerds
Right.
like us drool at this type of life where they live in such an erudite way. But that seems to be no longer a possibility, or at least it's certainly not an actuality in modernity. And one potential thing that we're missing is humanities guiding politics in some way, right? Because and we're going to talk about this today, their learning served as a guide for their political life. Do you see any substitute like that in modernity? Because obviously the professional class is alive and well today,
Right.
but I don't think there's any more of this gentleman scholar class anymore.
Very little, I would say. It's very hard because, as I said, scholarship has become so professionalized and institutionalized, and therefore, there are also a lot of barriers. And the professoriate is sort of, guarding its ivory tower. For good reasons, right? Because,
Right.
you want to have a certain type
Serious
of quality
scholarship, right.
control. But certainly, if you think about the 18th century, for example, in England, 18th century aristocrats, and into the 19th century, you get a lot of the gentleman scholar.
Right.
And it's only maybe sort of from the late 19th century that goes away.
And when you look at history, we're probably the anomaly, right? Political power and humanity's erudition has been disjointed. And when you look at China, for example, and imperial exams, this always seemed to be the case until, like you said, the 19th and the 20th century. And I don't think it's actually that the people in political power have become less erudite, but I think it's a change in focus of what subjects to specialize in.
Right.
And today, right, it's STEM.
Yes.
The way you are learned as someone living in the active life is you have a math PhD and then you build an AI company and something like that. So, but we are living in a quite unique time that these two things are disjointed. Don't you think so?
No, I think that's right. I think for a long time, even into the 20th century, as sort of humanistic education was still treated as part of, a preparation.
Right? The Oxford PPE, that's
exactly. And or you studied classics in Oxford and then you entered the Foreign Service or something like that. Of course, people always ask, like, what good are these studies?
Right.
Can you make any money? With studying philosophy or the classics or something like that. And of course, this is a concern, and that was not a concern when people who were studying them were independently rich.
Right. And I want to ask, I think, a corollary of this question, not is it profitable for an individual, but is it good for a society? That's the political power and humanities joined. Well, I'm going to wait to ask that question until the very end, after we discuss Cicero and Caesar in full detail. But before we discuss Cicero and Caesar, I want to ask one last general question, which is, when we think Rome, when we think antiquity and intellectual culture, we think the Greeks.
Right.
We don't think the Romans. Why is that?
Yeah, this is sort of one of my missions in life to, work against this preconception. But there is a reason for that, and this starts already in the Roman period. The thing is this, that the Greek culture is earlier. So, important events in Greek literature, Greek history, happen at a time when not much was going on in Rome. So the Romans are sort of entering the Mediterranean scene, and there is already this high culture. And then they basically base their culture on Greek culture from the beginning, which is something that is extremely rare, especially since they then become the military and political power. So it's a sort of the opposite of normal imperialism, so that shall we say, the imperializing power does not impose its culture on the colonized, if you want to use this term, country, but on the contrary, takes the culture of the defeated country and tries to make it into its own. So the Romans already have this kind of inferiority complex, and which comes through in how they're talking about it. But they then, create their own culture, their own writing, and Greece and Rome are these twin cultures, which is why they're studied together in classics departments. But there is this perception that becomes especially strong again in the late 18th and the 19th century, that the Greek culture is the original culture, it's the sort of purer culture, it's the superior culture, and that the Romans are these imitators, right? And there is a certain truth to that, because the Romans, to be incredibly general, they have often a different approach. So when it comes to philosophy, no, they're not maybe as original thinkers as a lot of the Greek thinkers, but they are much more interested in applying philosophy and in sort of systematizing philosophy and in sort of passing it on to a larger public. And then, in fact, they end up passing it on to later centuries. So, I mean, it's a stereotype, but the Romans are more practical in a way, and they may also be more practical in their intellectual approaches, something that very much appealed to the Middle Ages, to the early modern period, still to the early 18th century. But then with the rise of Romanticism, and also with the rise of modern classics and philology, especially in Germany, this suddenly became seen as a liability.
So it seems like whether your age thinks the Romans or the Greeks are superior probably tells you a bit more about your age.
That's correct.
Than it does about Rome versus Greece, right? Because it
yeah.
seems like if we were in the medieval times, we might have all thought that, of course, the Romans, the people who actually embodied these ideas were superior, exactly. And the Greeks, Socrates.
Well, they didn't know that much about the Greeks, right? In the Middle Ages, that was the other thing. So Rome was much more. I mean, Roman culture was much, much more influential on Western thought and culture for the very reason that for centuries and centuries, most of Greek culture was unknown.
Right. How do you think Roman scholarship fares when you compare it to Greek scholarship? You describe this one very general, obviously difference of the practical versus theoretical, but in terms of quality and expanse and depth, how do you think it fares?
I'm fairly biased. I think it fares very well because. Well, I mean, there are other reasons. I mean, we also have lost a lot of Greek scholarship. So Rome, in a way, a lot of our knowledge of ancient philosophy, for example, Hellenistic philosophy, Stoicism, Epicureanism, which is very important to these Romans. If we didn't have the Roman sources, we basically wouldn't know anything about it. So in many ways, we just know more about the Romans. But maybe this is also because at least people like Cicero, who are writing a very, pleasing style, who are trying to make this material very attractive and accessible, have succeeded in that, whereas a more sort of academic writing that we find in a lot of Greek philosophy, just over time, did not find that many readers.
Let me play the devil's, or in this case, the Greeks' advocate here, which is to say, where is your Plato? Cicero, you wrote on the Republic, but that doesn't hold a candle to the Republic.
Right.
Where's your Homer? You have Virgil, and that's already somewhat of an imitation, and that speaks again more to our romantic sentiments of originality, maybe, than what is good art and scholarship itself. And where's your Sophocles? Where are your great tragedians? What do you respond to that, just in terms of the great text produced by the Greeks and the towering figures that they left behind?
I think the Greeks left behind an amazing literature and an amazing philosophy, and the Romans left behind an amazing literature. So it's not, even though the Romans like to think of it as a competition, right? I mean, you don't have to look at it this way. I mean, I think we should be grateful to have both. And I mean, Plato is obviously incredibly important, including to Cicero, for that matter. And I mean, the works of Plato, though, even there, the literary qualities of the works of Plato and the not just purely hardcore philosophical qualities, I think, are being increasingly appreciated. So it's not just, the Greeks are just writing dry dissertations and the Romans are writing fun treatises. I mean, Plato is fun too. I think there are differences, and someone like Cicero, at least, is not trying to be an original thinker in the way Plato is, though he does have original thoughts. But I mean, I think both these approaches, can exist side by side and can both be appreciated.
Right. So what I'm hearing as the general difference is that they just had fundamentally different intentions. And we see that in the structure of the sociology of knowledge, right? Where Cicero primarily was concerned about governance, and Plato, when the times he's writing, he's primarily an intellectual.
Right. That's correct.
Now that we have a lay of the land of this sort of late Republican Rome intellectual landscape, which, as a brief summary, is this gentleman scholar, aristocrat, philosophers, and the actual professional, sort of full-time philosophers, I want to spend the rest of this interview investigating two of the not only intellectual titans, but also political titans, Cicero and Caesar, to really understand how they gel together, the active and the contemplative life, and maybe as a model of how we might do the same today in the 21st century. So let's start with Cicero. Who was Marcus Cicero?
So Marcus Tullius Cicero came from a town outside Rome and was a so-called new man, which meant that he was the first member of his family to enter politics in Rome. So mostly it was a sort of closed society where if you entered the Senate and started a political career, your family, had been doing this for a long time. But there was some sort of social mobility. And so he was able to do that. And it was extremely successful. So he ran for all the offices. He was always elected at the first try, which means that then you can enter the Senate once you have first been elected to the so-called quaestorship. And he made his name, especially in his early years, as an orator. So he pleaded cases. And
like a lawyer almost.
A lawyer. The thing is, they didn't have a professional class of lawyers. And so if you needed to be represented in court, you had to ask like someone you knew or someone then knew someone else. So these members of the upper classes, in addition to being politicians and maybe intellectuals, they also typically appeared in court. And so being well-trained in rhetoric was incredibly important. It was the main form of education because you had to speak in court and you had to speak in the Senate and you had to give speeches to the people. So being able to express yourself was just paramount. And this was something that Cicero excelled at. And this certainly, was a big, I think, factor in his success. And so he became consul, which was the highest office, in 63. And then it so happened, famously, that there was a conspiracy, the so-called Catilinarian conspiracy, where a disaffected nobleman and a group of other people, very high-placed members of society, really wanted to start a kind of uprising and kill people and take over power. It's not totally sure how this would actually have worked. But anyway, so this was uncovered. And Cicero was sort of instrumental in suppressing this conspiracy. I was incredibly proud of this, but it was a problem because some of these conspirators were executed in a way that was probably not entirely constitutional, because there were very strong laws that were governing the rights of citizens, and there was no proper trial. And there was an argument that this was an emergency covered by an emergency clause, but it was all a little bit problematic. And this led to lots of problems for Cicero down the line. Because
these are the enemies that he created, or?
These are enemies that he created. And so this is in 63. And starting in the 50s BCE, Roman politics becomes more and more chaotic. It was already chaotic before, but you get these different factions. And you get this so-called popularis faction, people who are making use of sort of techniques that undermine the traditional power of the Senate. And Caesar was one of these people. Caesar and some other people, and they were able to consolidate power in their hands in the 50s in something that is known as the first triumvirate, which was Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. And Cicero, who was against that, because Cicero was very much a sort of moderate conservative who wanted to keep the power of the Senate intact, was sidelined. And then there was a law passed against people who had put Roman citizens to death without a trial, which was an ad hominem law against Cicero. And then Cicero had to go into exile, and he was very distraught. And while he was able to come back a year later, he was politically sidelined because this was now the sort of rising of the likes of Caesar. And this all then led in 49 to the civil war between Caesar, this is the famous crossing of the Rubicon, and then Pompey, who had previously been an ally of Caesar, actually joined the senatorial party, and you get the civil war, but the senatorial party is defeated. So Cicero again joins the senatorial party, but they are defeated, and Caesar makes himself a dictator. And again, Cicero is very unhappy and is sort of sidelined. Then, of course, Caesar is assassinated. And Cicero does not hide his satisfaction with this event. But this leads to more civil war. And then just a year and a half after Caesar was assassinated, Cicero is killed by what is now the second triumvirate, where the adopted son of Caesar, Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, Mark Antony, and a man called Lepidus join the so-called second triumvirate. And the first thing they do is they transcribe all their enemies, including Cicero, which means that they can be killed without punishment. And this happens. So Cicero is assassinated. So it turns out that Cicero, even though he was very successful, especially early in his career, ends up being on the wrong side of history because the Roman Republic is coming to an end in these civil wars. And what you get then, of course, is the empire with Augustus, the first emperor.
And throughout this very productive or tumultuous, however you want to look at it, political life, he wrote some of the most important treatises of Roman scholarship.
Yes.
And the first thing I want to focus on is what you described Cicero as a Numan. Mm-hmm. Does that mean like lower aristocracy, or does that mean regular, like non-aristocratic, regular citizen?
The sort of stratification of Rome really worked was by money. So it was a property requirement.
Oh, really? It wasn't a heritability thing?
Well, I mean, it's sort of,
morphed into,
obviously in practice worked out this way. So there were a lot of these old families, and they were also very rich. But in order to have a political career, you had to have a certain amount of property. And then the stratum, we haven't talked about that yet, but the stratum below that are the so-called equites or knights, which goes back to some like hoary old time, and these were actually the knights in the Roman army. So these were very rich people who did not have political careers, and these were often the businessmen. And some of them were also intellectually very active, like, for example, Cicero's famous friend Atticus. And so if you were in that category, but if you had actually enough money to enter a political career, then you could say, okay, I want to now enter a political career. I qualify for a senatorial career, I'm going to do it. So this is where Cicero's family was at. So they had enough money to be equites, and they could just have stayed that way. And, Cicero could have, entered business. But they were rich enough that they were like, okay, let's try it. Let's do it. I want to become a senator.
Right.
Whereas some other people never did. I mean, Atticus, for example, never wanted to. But despite the fact that it was money-based, there was a kind of societal background because the old families looked down on these new men who, suddenly wanted to join the Senate. So there was a bit of a fight, and there was a bit of a, needing to assert yourself.
Right. But that's what I suspected, that it wasn't a rags to riches story necessarily. But I bet Cicero's learning and his scholarship, not just translated to his oratory, was instrumental to his political career, right? And maybe that's like a corollary to what we have today, where today, if you want to make money, you go study STEM.
Yeah.
Right? You study STEM, again, you become an AI engineer or something like that. Where it seemed like the way you rise in society in Rome was to master the classics. And this was also how you rose in the Chinese Imperium, right? By the Chinese imperial exams. Is that maybe one other reason why these power and humanities were conjoined?
Certainly, He put enormous effort into his training. I mean, he was very well trained. He went to Greece. He obviously put a lot of effort into his training as an orator, which also involved reading a lot of literature, reading a lot of speeches. So yeah, I think maybe he was overcompensating, or maybe he just knew that that was the ticket. I mean, to which extent being very knowledgeable in philosophy was an asset at the time, who knows? But certainly, I mean, he had to make it clear that he was like absolutely intellectually at the top level.
Let's talk about Cicero's academic training, specifically that he was a self-proclaimed follower of the academic skeptics.
Right.
Tell us about this school of philosophy at the time.
Right. If we talk about the academy and academic, right, we mean the school of Plato. So Plato, founded a philosophical school called the Academy, and after Plato's death, this school went on to exist for centuries and centuries and centuries. But there were changes over time in the outlook. And so in the 3rd century BCE, interestingly, the Academy, I mean, we think of Plato, we think about about metaphysics, we think about the theory of forms, incredibly important. But interestingly enough, at that point, the Academy took a very skeptical turn. And what they were saying was that we're actually going back to Socrates, right? Because Socrates, you could say, was a skeptic, because Socrates would always ask these questions.
He's ignorant. Right.
Claimed to be ignorant and never believed anything that people told him, right? He was always questioned this. And so people went back in the 3rd century, the Academy went back to the skepticism that they traced back to Socrates, and basically had this idea that nothing can be known for certain. So what we have to do is, in a Socratic fashion, we just have to investigate everything. We really have to look at all questions from all perspectives, from each side. But if you're sort of really a radical skeptic, in the end, you just have to withhold judgment. So you don't just throw up your hands and say, oh, nothing can be known, therefore end of story. But you actually really look at everything. But then in the end, you say, we can't know enough. We withhold judgment. And there are different permutations of that. There's a sort of softer version of that, which is a probabilist version from, the word probable, which probabilis means really it can be approved. So it means like, if you put out some kind of statement, whether it's something etymological or whether it's some sort of ethical guideline, and you say, well, I don't want to stick out my head and say that this is absolutely true, but I can approve of it. Or as they say, it is very similar. It's similar to the truth. And then I can live by this statement. I can live by this, ethical guidance. I can live by this etymological, not truth, but thing that's similar to the truth. And so, I can act, but I'm not going to say this is actually true. So I'm not going to be dogmatic about it. Plus, I reserve the right to change my mind any day. So if I tomorrow don't think that's so approvable and probable anymore, then I will, I will say something different. And
right.
that's what my philosophy is.
There's a few things I want to highlight of what you just said there. The first is that the method of the skeptic is almost like a survey of the other schools, right? It's kind of like the training of an orator
yeah.
or a training of a modern debate, right?
Yeah.
Where you're taught to argue all sides. But at the crux of it is the belief that truth, at least capital T truth, cannot be obtained. But where did that axiom came from? And it seems like, do they dogmatically hold this? Because Plato and Socrates, as we know, they did believe that they arrived at maybe not final truths, but wild metaphysical speculations.
Right.
So where does that dogmatic assertion come from?
Well, I mean, I think it either just comes out of, if you can sort of say, personal practice, like I've never found anything that I thought was
empirical
true.
Almost, right.
Or, there are certainly also popular idea that human beings just can't know everything. I mean, like someone says, it's for the gods to know, but for human beings to have opinions. So there is a sort of already strain of epistemological pessimism that, some things can't be known. And you could always say, well, you may not want to be dogmatic about it because then you're dogmatic about something, right? So if you say nothing can be known, is that then suddenly a truth? And then, then you get into all these like crazy,
rabbit holes, right?
And so you could still say, well, maybe something can be known. I've never been satisfied. I think this is how you might want to argue this.
There's something distinctively Ciceronian about skepticism and skeptical about Cicero. The first thing I highlighted already was arguing sort of every school is the form of oratory or debate. But even in Cicero's political career, he's famous for being able to compromise.
Right.
To sort of pull upon all these political factions and for famously changing his mind.
Right.
And I think this is something that we're going to see throughout all the interviews we do today. Cato, for example, Stoicism, it's not about the outcome, it's about your intentions. Cato was a hardliner. So there's a beautiful aesthetic congruency between their intellectual life and their political life.
Yes.
Is that right?
No, I absolutely agree with that. On the one hand, the skepticism and the skeptical method clearly appealed to Cicero because it was so close to oratory. Because, this is, of course, what you do. You argue, there's this expression of like arguing each side.
Right.
And that's, of course, what happens in a court case. And a lawyer has to be prepared to argue different sides. And Cicero was very prepared to do that. But then I think you're right. It's also his personality and it's also his politics that, he was able to compromise. He changed his mind and he did also agonize over what to do. Like, for example, at the outbreak of the Civil War, after Caesar did cross the Rubicon, so this is in 49 and 48, Cicero spent a lot of time trying to figure out what he was going to do. Because Pompey then, got up an army and ultimately they went to Greece. And ultimately, Cicero joined him, but it took him a while to decide is this really what I want to do? Is this what is the right thing to do? Is this, what a wise person would do under the circumstances? And you can actually trace that in his letters to his friend Atticus. And he even describes that he with himself engages nearly like in these debates. Self-debate, that he's like arguing different sides of the, of the case to himself before making up his mind.
I had a question coming into this interview that I think is partially answered by this probabilistic interpretation of skepticism. And the question is, how can a skeptic be a forceful political actor? Because when we think skeptic, or at least the cartoon skeptic, they're mired in doubt. They can't take one step because they don't know if this is going to be ground. But probabilism is a way to get around that, where, I'm still acting. I'm just not certain about my actions. And so maybe that actually gives political action a nice kind of flexibility.
Yeah. It's a sort of humility in a way. That, you can't be totally sure, but you're pretty sure. You're sure enough for the purpose of action, right? I think that's what it is.
Right.
Whereas ultimately, truth, fine. So that's great for philosophers. So they can just spend all day, debating about what truth is. But if you want to act, there is the sort of like, it's good enough. At the same time, you're also keeping questions open, right? Because you're not dogmatic, you're not ideological. You're not saying, well, we've decided once and for all that this is the right thing to do. It's like, actually now, come to think of it, maybe that's not right because, there's new information or having thought it over. So, I think it's actually a
feature, not a bug, right? That it might aid in political action. And we do see this in Cicero, that through this type of academic self-debate and throughout the years, he does change his own positions and maneuver. And this is, again, what he's famous for.
Right.
This
or infamous for some people.
His ability to sort of compromise and change, right? Let me give you a quote from your book. In the ending of his On the Republic, Cicero reaffirms his belief in politics as man's highest calling, incorporating it into a grand cosmological scheme whereby virtuous statesmen are granted a blessed afterlife among the stars in the Milky Way. Okay, that doesn't sound too skeptical.
No, that's
not just the cosmology, but this is the thing that I want to emphasize on. This idea that serving the state is man's higher end.
Yeah.
Where did Cicero get that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a not uncommon ancient view that a lot of philosophies argue that human beings are by nature social, or political animals, as Aristotle said, so that hanging with other people, building communities, having states, engaging in politics is actually part of human nature. This is what we do. And these kinds of ancient philosophies are always about do the thing that is appropriate to human nature. So in a way, you want to become a human being to the highest possible extent. And this is very often the sort of social and political engagement is viewed as being part of that. So that's not unusual. I mean, Aristotle is kind of on the fence about it, whether it's the active or the contemplative life. The Stoics definitely think it's the active life and hence the political life. It's only the Epicureans who really don't think that.
Right.
So that's not that unusual. And then I guess coupled with a sort of good old Roman idea that what is the greatest thing that could happen to you is like be in the Senate and be. So I think that comes in there. Now, the sort of metaphysical idea that, this is, somehow part of a cosmic scheme, because indeed, at the end of Cicero's On the Republic, there is a dream vision that the main protagonist has, where indeed he goes up to the Milky Way and he meets his dead father and grandfather, who have also been great Roman statesmen, and is told that this is the reward that awaits him. Now, you could say, okay, either this is just the sort of probable for Cicero, or maybe even less than the probable, because he brings it in as a dream, right? Just like Plato, and this is modeled on the myth of at the end of the of Plato's Republic, where someone has a near-death experience and comes back and tells about it. And in fact, this is a kind of a critical reply to Plato, because it's like, near-death experience, you must be kidding me. Who has that? But dreams, everybody dreams. It's much more realistic to have a dream, but then at the same time, it's also not the truth with a capital T, because it's just a dream. So Cicero distances himself a little bit, but it's clearly sort of something he wants to believe. Mm-hmm. And we often get in Cicero something where he puts out like his ideal scenario, what he would most like it to be. And then he has in a skeptical fashion, is like, oh, but if it isn't this way, then at least, for example, he says, it'd be really good if the soul were immortal. And there are many people who said this, and, Socrates and the Phaedo, and there are many reasons to believe why the soul is immortal. And then it's like, but if the soul should turn out to be mortal, then this is not a problem either, because then death is just an end to everything, and there's nothing bad that happens after death, so we don't have to be. So it's a little bit like that. So ideally, I would like this, but if it's that, that's fine too.
That's interesting. In some sense, then, skepticism allowed Cicero, gave him license to actually engage in sort of crazy metaphysical speculations in a way, right? Because suddenly you don't need the type of certainty you would if you weren't a skeptic, right? Because you say, well, no, that's probable. It's probable that the virtuous statesmen go to Olympus and ask the gods for advice. Right. So that's a very interesting turn of skepticism that actually allows Cicero to indulge himself, let me put it that way, in these type of speculations. Let's go back to this idea of the political good. Mm-hmm. So what I got from your answer was that it didn't come from skepticism. It came from this other more traditional Roman sort of thought. And the way I understood Cicero is that you should engage in politics for the sake of the Commonwealth, right? Not for glory, certainly not for self-interest. I think it's more clear that someone like Sulla or Pompey or Caesar, right, were more explicitly motivated by self-interest or glory, right? But Cicero, do you think that he lived up to those ideas?
Well, I'm going to stick out my neck. I think he did. I mean, to what extent, he did a, good job of it, or he certainly wasn't very successful.
But his intentions,
I think his intentions were thus. He made it sort of totally part of his persona, right? So this is like for himself who he was. And so you could argue that then like doing something for the state was also doing something for himself. But I think he was convinced that that was his motivation and that he wanted to act for the common good. I actually think so.
That's quite extraordinary, because not just when you compare him to other senators who are clearly motivated by self-interest or glory, but you even compare him to people we know today, like business people or politicians who claim they're helping, right?
Right.
And it's clear they're doing it for themselves. So is that a pro for philosophy, maybe, that it was through this academic self-analysis that he got to this and stuck to it? Is there something to be said there?
I think you could say that. I mean, I don't want to claim that other people in the Roman Republic didn't also enter, politics with a sort of idea of public service. Plus, I mean, I think there are always multiple motivations that people have. But yeah, I mean, I think Cicero's philosophical training did probably contribute to this attitude. And then conversely, his philosophical writing for him, was a way to try to get these ideas out there. Right. I mean, I think he saw that as part of his mission.
So we just discussed how philosophy led Cicero to public service, but I think there's an interesting other relationship here where philosophy was a way for Cicero to do public service. That, in your words, philosophy was politics by other means. Mm-hmm. Can you give us a few examples of how Cicero's intellectual production, or so he conceived, was a way to benefit the Republic?
Right. No, Cicero basically said that himself, that when he was writing his philosophical works, he was still doing a service to the Roman people and to the Republic. Now, it has to be said that Cicero mostly wrote these works in the 50s, when he was already politically sidelined during the First Triumvirate, and then after the Civil War.
But that's not 40s. A negative against him, right?
No, it's not a negative, but he always sort of viewed it as his kind of second best. I mean, he would much rather have been politically active, and seeing that he couldn't be, he also, used this other, this other activity now, which he also says has had other purposes, like, for example, self-consolation, both over the bad political situation, and then his daughter died in the 40s, and some of the philosophical writing is clearly a reaction to that. But he certainly also saw the philosophical and other writings, as part as a sort of educational mission, where he wanted to educate his readers in Greek philosophy and similar things, but also a kind of moral message that he wanted to get across.
Right. So that's Cicero, one of the towering intellectual giants. Let's move on to Caesar.
Yes.
I don't think anyone needs an introduction of the biography of Caesar, but what I think your book captures so well that people missed is his intellectual life and intellectual production. So give us an overview of Caesar's intellectual life.
Cicero, everybody knows he was a writer, he was an orator, he wrote long books that kids have to read in Latin class. But Caesar is known as a general, as a Roman politician, as someone who managed to, make himself sole ruler of Rome. But he was also, like, all the members of the upper classes, he was extremely well educated. We don't know that much about his education. He was not clearly as much a philosopher or into philosophy, but he had other interests. So he was also a famous orator. And this is where so often we're actually suffering from the fact that so much from antiquity doesn't survive, and that Cicero is kind of crowding out, all the literary production of his peers, including for Caesar's speeches. But we have his writings about his own wars, the war in Gaul, of course, the commentaries, and the Civil War, which have a very specific style, which was sort of famous already at the time because it's very spare and very austere in a way.
Unadorned, right.
Unadorned.
Systematic.
Which you can also then, I mean, we were just trying to make this argument about Cicero the man and Cicero the thinker. And with Caesar, you can also say that this Caesar, this incredibly rational person, rational in his actions, in his political actions.
Brutal almost, yeah.
Brutal, and also his style. I mean, he was very rational, and indeed, wasn't just his style himself, but he really made an important intervention in discussions of Latin style at the time. So discussions of Latin style and the Latin language were also very prevalent at the moment. I mean, Cicero entered this a little bit because he wrote about oratory, of course, and he was a master of style. Caesar and Cicero had very different ideas about style and also about language. And there was this seems incredibly recondite discussion about analogy and anomaly. And this is about regularity in language. So if you have inflections, right? So if in English all plurals end in S, right? What do you then do if you suddenly have a plural that's different, like children, right? So children is the plural of child. So why is it not childs, right? So that's anomaly. Whereas if you have brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, and they all end in S, that's analogy. And so it seems like some people were more pushing analogy and use of analogical forms, whereas some people were more in favor of sticking with even archaic forms, like, say, archaic, plural of brother is brethren, right, which is sometimes used. And so Caesar wrote a book that's actually called De Analogia, right, that we only have fragments of, but where he was sort of addressing this. And it's kind of sort of interesting to think that Caesar, sort of very rational in his action, very sort of clear and unadorned in his writing, also seems to push a kind of grammar that is very regular and is very rational.
Childs instead of children is Caesar's preference,
yes.
right? It must end with S.
Yeah. He probably, to give him justice, he wouldn't have gone for something that was unidiomatic, right, but the Latin language was still very much in flux at the time. Right. It's sort of the written language was just becoming codified. And so, people like, what's the genitive of this word? There are multiple options out there, and you come down on this side or on that side. And,
And so Cicero is on the other side. It's on the anomaly, right?
Is more on the other side, because Cicero is, Cicero's style is the style of abundance, copia. Right. So Cicero, I think, who said this, that from Caesar's style, you can't take anything away because it's so bare. Right. But to Cicero's style, you can't add anything because all the sort of different, aspects, all the variations have already been rung.
And so the argument of analogy, which again, to use the childs and children example, analogy would be childs, right? We stick with the S, plurals must have S. Anomaly, children, is really a debate between reason and habit. Yes. Right? Like, what is rational? What is systematic? What is right?
Yes.
And what can we live with?
Exactly.
What have we used?
Exactly.
And again, it's so fascinating that the skeptic Cicero, the man famous for compromise, even in his discussion of style, prefers anomaly. And Caesar, the sort of rational, almost brutish, the sort of hard-edged person prefers analogy. Yes. Right?
Yes.
And that's another fascinating. Yeah. And what's even more fascinating, I think that you didn't mention, but you did in your book, is that Caesar wrote his treatise on analogy while fighting in Gaul, while he was fighting one of the most dangerous campaigns in the history of Rome, right?
Yes. Now, this is what we're told. Maybe this is just a nice anecdote, but yes, we are told that he was like writing it while like spears were flying left and right. Caesar was famous for being able to multitask. So he had these like amazing abilities to do different things at the same time.
And if there's one sort of example or story that shows how conjoined the act of a contemplative life is, it should be the image of Caesar fighting in Gaul while mulling over the details of Latin oratory. Right. But let's just dive into the psychology. And we're going to have to speculate here of Caesar in the moment. what in the world was he thinking? Like, you got a war to fight. Like, is it a nice pastime to distract you from your war? Is it just what a gentleman does, or what's going on?
I mean, that is very hard to know. I mean, maybe it is a little bit what a gentleman does to sort of you relax at the same time, or is it a showing off of, I mean, there is this idea of the sort of Caesar's personality as being extremely cold-blooded. I mean, not perturbed by, and as you're saying, rational. I mean, so why not, if I have some time to do this at the same time, what prevents me from doing this?
Another extraordinary intellectual accomplishment that is also hyper-rational is Caesar's calendar reforms, right? So which in a way is also a fight between rationality and habit.
Yes.
So tell us about what Caesar's innovation was there.
Yes. So the Roman calendar was a mess because was it 350 days?
355.
355 days. The Roman calendar was originally, which meant that in order to get it in sync with the lunar year, you had to intercalate a month. To add a month, like a leap month, so to speak, at regular intervals. Now, however, this intercalation was done by the so-called pontiffs and the priests, which were really also members of the Roman political elite, and either for political reasons or because of just incompetence or frankly not really understanding how this works. In the late Republic, the calendar was more and more out of sync with the seasons. So Caesar, with the help of Greek astronomer, reformed the calendar and instituted the calendar that we have now. So the Julian calendar that we use now, which only had to be tweaked once, but only a tiny little bit in the early modern period, with the 365 days, that is all Julius Caesar's calendar reform, and that's something that he put in while he was dictator in the 40s.
Right, and that's another example where everyone knew that the calendar was off, that a year was not 355. But no one had the idea to, let's reform the calendar.
Right.
Because, why? Well, because it was habit.
Right.
That the calendar should be 355. But Caesar just came in and said, well, to hell with habit.
Exactly.
We're gonna focus on what's the right amount of days. Which is why the 7th month of the year is July,
yes.
right? Is named after him, and the 8th month is named after his adopted son, Augustus. Was Caesar also an astronomer then? Or did he have helpers who helped him compile this?
He had helpers. So we're told about this astronomer from Alexandria, Sosigenes, whom he may have met when he was in Alexandria during the war and during his encounters with Cleopatra in Egypt. And Alexandria was a big intellectual and cultural capital at the time. But I still, think that he must have enough understanding. And frankly, I mean, this is not the craziest astronomy. I mean, this is not rocket science. I mean, we can understand, how this works. And the thing, though, is that he did then write a treatise about this. He wrote a work on the calendar reform, De Astris, where he explained that. And again, I mean, it's not incredibly, complicated science. I see no reason not to believe that, as we are told, he actually wrote that himself.
Right. I want to try to tie all this into Caesar's potential philosophy in the way that we tied Cicero into skepticism. Some people think that Caesar was an Epicurean.
Yes.
Right. One example is that he married the daughter, I believe, of a leading Epicurean.
Right.
One of the Epicureanism's key tenets is a form of atomism, right? That its metaphysics is very materialist. Might there be, maybe you'll have to squint here, a case where if you believe that the world is just atoms buzzing around, then suddenly habits lose their force. Suddenly concepts like Roman honor or the sanctity of the Republic, we can do away with that. We can rearrange these atoms. Is that too far of a stretch?
Yeah, maybe that's too far of a stretch. I mean, you could argue that it does take the willingness to sort of step back and say, oh, all these things that, that we're seeing in reality, they're just atom and void. So you're willing to go to a very high level of abstraction and to also be completely calm about this. And it's like, yeah, that's just the way it is. I mean, it's, in fact, I mean, it was not Epicurus, but Democritus, who was an earlier developer of atomic theory, who says by convention, colors and tastes and, other things you can perceive through the senses. But in reality, so there's only atoms and void. So if you take this idea of convention, so if you want to run with this, that Cicero would be saying, well, by convention, there are all these things, but it's just convention because in reality, there is only atoms and void. I don't know. I mean, I think that goes pretty far. I mean, there are some contexts in which it does seem like Cicero did at least espouse certain Epicurean tenets, like the fact that death is not only nothing to be feared, but that it is really just our falling into our constituent atoms and we are no longer there, and a kind of nonchalance, in the face of death.
I see. So we've discussed Cicero and Caesar, and the thing that I think we'll keep coming back to is that there's a surprising consistency between their philosophical ideas, between their political habits, and to even minute things like their rhetorical style, that there's an immense coherency here. But let me quote to you your book here. This unique Roman Republic of letters, this entire aristocratic system that we've described, did not survive the fall of the actual republic. When Caesar's adopted son Augustus brought in the empire, how did the sociology of knowledge change in Rome?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the ways people went about reading and writing and discussing remained the same, but this class has basically lost its political power because the power was just
the aristocracy.
So the power was just concentrated in the hand of the emperor and maybe the imperial family, and while the Senate and other republican structures persisted, they were mostly ceremonial. So you could be an administrator, but you couldn't be a politician.
Right.
So there certainly is still a lot of intellectual activity on the part of the upper classes, but this strong intertwining of politics and intellectual activity, that just goes away.
But when we look at people like Pliny the Elder, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, these were like Cicero and Caesar, right, where they did integrate philosophy, especially Aurelius, into their political activity, no? So that persisted.
I mean, that was, of course, Marcus Aurelius is a very special case because he was the emperor. I mean, sure, Pliny, both Plinies and Seneca, they were these, again, senator scholars. And they played some important political roles. The Pliny is really more as administrators. Seneca, a little bit interesting because he was a main advisor to the Emperor Nero, but then fell from favor. But it was still not the same thing. I mean, it was not the same thing as being in this republic, where individual members of the senatorial aristocracy, really had a chance to run the state on their own. And in this case, they are just employees, to use a somewhat, anachronistic term, of the political system.
So it's not a republic of letters; it's a bureaucracy of letters.
It's a bureaucracy of letters. No,
right.
I think that's right, especially right for the Plinies.
Right, I see. So we've discussed the necessary supporting conditions for what makes such a republic of letters possible. I want to move on to the last question of this interview, which is it desirable? And let me draw out the first line of concern and critique, which is that it seems like intellectual flourishing is always combined with chaos in the world. In your book, you described how the chaos of late Roman Republic, right, this is the Civil War, was the backdrop for people like Cicero and Caesar, even for their scholarship. And when you look throughout history, right, the Greek Golden Age and the Peloponnesian War. You look at Augustine and the sack of Rome. You look at Hegel and the Napoleonic Wars. You look at the most vibrant period of Chinese philosophy, which is the Warring States, right? Should we be glad that we don't live in a time of intellectual flourishing? Because it means that, look, all the things are nice and calm. And, philosophers, there's not that many big questions to ask because the world is relatively stable.
I'm not sure I entirely, buy this
premise.
Scenario, this premise. I mean, yes, I think it's certainly true in this case that the political upheaval and the Civil War wasn't just the backdrop, but also sort of contributed to the development of ideas, etc. And I think this is very often the case. Then again, I think historically, you could sort of argue that all periods are periods of upheaval. So where are these totally peaceful periods? Then there's also an argument to be made for certain political and economic stability leading to a certain kind of intellectual flourishing. In the case of, building of institutions, for example, Victorian England, a comparatively quiet time. A lot of stuff going on, but not too horrible in times of upheaval. I want to say is a time of great intellectual flourishing. The Augustan period, you can say trauma was just so much in the past. This is still an example of. But there you have a time where you suddenly have peace and everybody's incredibly grateful and happy that they have peace. Right. And there is this flourishing.
Virgil.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know whether there's sort of one reason why there are periods of intellectual flourishing or whether it's such a confluence of different factors. Right.
So fingers crossed, we're going to enter both intellectual flourishing as well as political peace for us.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's one critique of desirability. I was asking you whether intellectual flourishing might be considered a symptom of chaos.
Yeah.
Now, I think the even more important question on desirability is whether it might not be a cause of chaos itself, right? And this would be someone like Rousseau in the first discourse, Critique of Enlightenment.
Yeah.
That when you inject humanities into political life in such a way, you're going to inspire luxury and idleness. You're going to have people who are charlatans who lead people astray. Rousseau's famous line in the first discourse is that Rome was fine when the Romans practiced virtue. All went down the gutter when they started studying it.
Right.
And so do you see that in this period? Do you see the learnedness of the senators of the time as being something that helped the development in this way? And obviously, the important question is to project that in this world.
Yeah.
What does our lack of humanities training of our elite, is that a good thing, perhaps?
Yeah, certainly very extreme here. But you do occasionally get these arguments, which again go back to older Roman arguments about this learning, it's also, it's Greek, it's what is it good for? It's sort of decadent. And then our young men are learning to question, the good old values, that their fathers taught them. And then you get some sort of whole decline, right? You can always make this sort of argument, but I think this does not hold water. Also, unlike maybe certain other ideas that proved very disruptive, maybe including some Enlightenment ideas or, great, say, religious upheavals when new religions come in or something like this or like whatever Marxism. I think in this case, these ideas are, comparatively, mild. On the whole, I would say that suppressing any kind of intellectual activities and any ideas, however potentially disruptive they might be, is always a bad idea, and that humanity will always more profit for ideas being aired and discussed rather than being suppressed. Apart from the fact that it is not possible to suppress these ideas anyway, and sooner or later, they are going to come out. So this idea that you sort of could keep some sort of steady state where everything is fine and there's not going to be any change, I think it's just completely impossible anyway.
I see. So it's not so much that all ideas are going to help political life, right?
No.
Certain ideas can certainly be disruptive,
Yeah.
but it's almost the converse of that, which is suppressing these ideas
Right.
isn't necessarily a sort of a dangerous
Right,
thing.
I think so.
Right. Well, thank you for coming on this interview and then airing these ideas out with us and sharing us about the fascinating intellectual climate of the late Roman Republic.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for watching my interview. If you want to go even deeper into these ideas, then join my email list at greatbooks.io. You'll not only get lectures and interviews, but also transcripts, book summaries, and essays, all to help you explore the most important books in history. Now, if you like this interview, there's 2 more that I filmed with Professor Volk on the ideas that shaped the late Roman Republic, one on Stoicism and the other on Epicureanism. Another direction you can go is to dive into a dramatization of this time period. Shakespeare's Julius Caesar covers the very ideas, people, and events we discussed in this interview. It's one of my favorite plays by the Bard and has shocking relevance to our current political situation. If that interests you, check out my lecture on Shakespeare's Caesar. You can find links to everything we discussed in the description, as well as on my website, greatbooks.io. Thank you.